The thunderous crack split the frozen Norman air as a metal cylinder, no more than 5 feet long, propelled an anti-tank rocket directly into the side armor of a German Panzer IV tank. Inside the steel beast, Oberfeldwebel Kurt Wagner and his crew of 4 experienced something few German tankers had encountered before: the sudden, terrifying knowledge that American infantry now possessed a weapon that could punch through their armor with a single shot. As the 60-meter warhead detonated against the Panzer's side, the shaped charge sent a jet of superheated metal through the armor plate at over 30,000 feet per second. The German tank, which had dominated the battlefield for years, was suddenly vulnerable to a man-portable weapon wielded by ordinary infantry soldiers. The psychological impact of this technological shift would prove as devastating as the physical destruction it caused. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now, let's get to the story. The confrontation between German armored divisions and American anti-tank infantry represents one of the most significant tactical evolutions in World War II. This encounter occurred in December 1944 during the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler's desperate gamble to split the Allied forces by driving a bulge into their lines through the dense Ardennes forest. The German offensive initially caught American forces by surprise, with Panzer divisions spearheading the assault through snow-covered forests and fog-shrouded valleys. For years, the German armored strategy had relied on a simple tactical truth: their tanks could destroy infantry positions with relative impunity, while foot soldiers had limited means to fight back effectively. The psychological advantage was clear. The sight and sound of approaching panzers often broke infantry morale before a shot was fired. German tank commanders like Wagner had operated with a sense of invulnerability that shaped their tactical approach. They were the predators of the battlefield, hunting rather than being hunted. The arrival of the bazooka, officially designated the M1A1 rocket launcher anti-tank, fundamentally altered this equation. Designed by American engineers Edward Uhl and Leslie Skinner at the U.S. Army's Ordnance Department in 1942, the weapon provided a portable, relatively lightweight solution to the infantry's tank problem. By December 1944, improved versions were in the hands of American infantry throughout the European theater of operations. The winter of 1944 was exceptionally cold. Snow blanketed the Ardennes, and visibility was frequently reduced to mere yards by dense fog. These conditions initially favored the German offensive, masking their movements and limiting Allied air support. Yet these same conditions would bring German armor and American anti-tank infantry into unexpected, close-quarter engagements that would demonstrate the devastating potential of the new weapon. Oberfeldwebel Kurt Wagner had served with the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich since 1942. A veteran of the Eastern Front and the Normandy campaign, Wagner had survived situations that had claimed the lives of many of his comrades. His Panzer IV, a medium tank that formed the backbone of German armored divisions, had been his home and fortress for most of the war. By December 1944, Wagner commanded a tank that had received numerous upgrades in armor and firepower, including the longer-barreled 75 calibre WK-40 gun capable of destroying most Allied tanks at combat ranges. The crew of Wagner's Panzer represented the diverse backgrounds typical of German tank units by this stage of the war. His gunner, Unterscharführer Heinrich Müller, had been a university student before the war. The loader, Rottenführer Franz Weber, came from a Bavarian farming family. The driver, Sturmann Walter Krause, had been a mechanic in civilian life, while the radio operator, Sturmann Dieter Hoffmann, had worked for a Berlin newspaper. Together, they had developed the tight-knit cohesion essential for tank crews to survive. In the American forces opposing the German offensive, the newly formed 99th Infantry Division included Private First Class Anthony Rusconi. A 22-year-old from Boston, Massachusetts, Rusconi had been drafted in 1943 and received specialized training as a bazooka operator. His assistant loader, Private James Wilson from rural Georgia, had never traveled outside his home state before the war. Together, they formed one of the many two-man bazooka teams distributed throughout American infantry units. The bazooka they operated was a product of American industrial and engineering ingenuity. The M1A1 version consisted of a simple steel tube approximately 54 inches long, weighing about 13 pounds empty. It fired a 3.5-pound rocket with a shaped charge warhead designed specifically to penetrate armor. The shaped charge was a revolutionary concept. Rather than relying on the kinetic energy of a projectile, it used the Monroe effect, focusing explosive energy to create a high-velocity jet of metal that could slice through armor plate. While the weapon's 100-yard effective range was limited, this would prove sufficient in the close terrain of the Ardennes. Unlike earlier anti-tank rifles, which had become largely ineffective against improved German armor, the bazooka could penetrate the side armor of any German tank in service. This capability represented a fundamental shift in infantry versus tank warfare. The preparation for the German offensive, codenamed Operation Autumn Mist, Unternehmen Herbstnebel, had been conducted under extraordinary secrecy. Tanks and heavy equipment were moved primarily at night. Radio silence was strictly enforced, and units were not briefed on their objectives until the last moment. Despite these precautions, some American intelligence officers had noted signs of the buildup, but their concerns were largely dismissed by senior commanders who believed the Ardennes sector too difficult for a major armored thrust. Wagner's Panzer IV was part of Kampfgruppe Peiper, a battle group commanded by SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper, one of the most aggressive and experienced German tank commanders on the Western Front. Their mission was to spearhead a rapid advance to the Meuse River, capturing key bridges before Allied forces could react. Speed was essential. The German offensive had to reach Antwerp to split Allied forces before American material superiority could be brought to bear. For the offensive, Wagner's tank had received a fresh coat of whitewash over its standard dark yellow Dunkelgelb camouflage pattern, helping it blend into the snow-covered landscape. The crew had also attached spare track links to the glacis plate and turret sides as improvised additional armor, a common practice that sometimes provided protection against hollow charge weapons by prematurely detonating them before they could penetrate the main armor. In the pre-dawn hours of December 16, 1944, over 1,600 German artillery pieces opened fire along an 80-mile front, marking the beginning of the offensive. The barrage primarily targeted command posts, artillery positions, and communication centers, rather than frontline positions. As shells fell across American positions, Wagner's tank, along with thousands of others, began moving forward through the darkness and mist. The initial advance met sporadic resistance. Many American units, surprised by the scale of the attack, fell back or were quickly surrounded. However, at key locations, determined resistance began to slow the German timetable. The 99th Infantry Division, including Rusconi and his bazooka team, held positions near the critical road junction at Krinkelt-Rocheret, directly in the path of elements of the 12th SS Panzer Division. Wagner's unit, advancing through the Losheim Gap, encountered increasing resistance as the first day progressed. Fuel shortages, a chronic problem for German forces, required strict conservation, with tanks sometimes being towed by half-tracks to save fuel. The narrow, winding roads of the Ardennes, combined with deteriorating weather, further slowed the advance. On the morning of December 17th, Wagner's company was ordered to clear American positions from a wooded ridge overlooking a critical road junction. Intelligence suggested minimal resistance, perhaps a reinforced platoon without heavy weapons. As Wagner's tank led three others toward the tree line, there was no indication that this engagement would differ from countless others in which German armor had prevailed against infantry. Rusconi and Wilson had established their position the previous evening, carefully selecting a location that offered both concealment and a clear field of fire along the most likely avenue of approach. They had dug a shallow pit for protection, camouflaged with pine branches, and prepared multiple rockets for rapid reloading. Their sergeant, a veteran of North Africa, had emphasized positioning. Let them get close. Wait until you can't miss. One shot, one kill. As Wagner's Panzer IV emerged from the morning mist at approximately 300 meters, Rusconi resisted the urge to fire immediately. The American soldiers could hear the distinctive sound of the German tank's Maybach engine and the squeak of its tracks as it advanced. At this range, even a perfectly aimed shot might not penetrate the frontal armor. They needed the tank to present its more vulnerable side. The geography of the encounter favored the defenders. The narrow road forced the German tanks to advance in column rather than line abreast, limiting their ability to provide mutual support. The ground was too soft off-road for rapid maneuvering, channeling the armor into predictable paths. The morning fog, while providing some concealment for the advancing Germans, also limited their visibility, preventing them from identifying threats until they were at close range. Inside his tank, Wagner scanned the ridge through his commander's vision blocks, alert for any sign of anti-tank guns. The tension inside the steel compartment was palpable. Each man focused on his assigned tasks. Krauss manipulated the steering levers, maintaining the tank's position in the center of the narrow road. Miller kept the turret traversed slightly right, covering the most likely location for ambush. Weber had a high-explosive round ready in the breech, ideal for dealing with infantry positions. Hoffman monitored the radio for any warnings from accompanying units. The confines of a Panzer IV were cramped and noisy. The five-man crew worked in a space approximately 7 feet in diameter, surrounded by ammunition, equipment, and the machinery of war. The interior smelled of oil, exhaust fumes, sweat, and cordite from previous engagements. Communication was primarily by intercom, though hand signals served as backup. Despite these challenging conditions, veteran crews like Wagner's functioned with a coordinated precision born of shared experience and mutual dependence. As the lead tank approached a slight bend in the road, it would need to turn, momentarily exposing its side armor to positions on the ridge. This was the moment Rusconi had been waiting for. At approximately 60 meters, well within the bazooka's effective range, Wagner ordered a halt to allow the gunner to sweep the suspected American positions with a burst of machine gun fire before proceeding. This momentary pause presented the perfect opportunity. Rusconi aimed carefully, compensating for the slight crosswind, while Wilson prepared to load a second rocket immediately after the first was fired. The bazooka made a distinctive whoosh sound as the rocket left the tube, leaving a trail of smoke that would immediately reveal their position. The rocket crossed the distance to the tank in less than a second. Wagner, alerted by the launch sound, began to shout an order to reverse, but the projectile struck the tank's right side before the driver could react. The shaped charge warhead functioned as designed, creating a focused jet of metal that penetrated the 30mm side armor as if it were paper. Inside the tank, the effect was catastrophic. The jet of molten metal moving at hypersonic velocity ignited ammunition stored in the sponson boxes. Secondary explosions filled the fighting compartment with fire and shrapnel. Weber and Hoffman died instantly. Miller, severely wounded, struggled to open the gunner's hatch. Wagner, despite burns to his face and hands, managed to throw open the commander's hatch and pull himself out of the burning vehicle. Krauss, the driver, remained trapped in his compartment as ammunition continued to cook off. The three supporting tanks immediately opened fire on the suspected rocket launch position. 75mm high-explosive shells and machine gun fire tore through the forest, forcing Rusconi and Wilson to hug the ground in their shallow pit. They had prepared for this response, knowing their position would be compromised after firing. What they hadn't anticipated was the catastrophic effect of their shot. Rather than merely disabling the tank, they had triggered a devastating ammunition fire that was rapidly consuming the vehicle and its crew. From his position on the turret, Wagner attempted to reach down through the commander's hatch to extract Miller, whose legs appeared to be trapped. The intense heat and continuing explosions forced him back. A secondary detonation, likely the main ammunition rack, threw Wagner clear of the tank. He landed heavily in the snow, his padded tanker's jacket smoldering. The supporting Panzer IV tanks, seeing the catastrophic destruction of the lead vehicle, began to withdraw, using smoke grenades to screen their movement. This standard German armored tactic, never allowing one loss to become multiple casualties, had been reinforced by the chronic shortage of both tanks and experienced crews by this stage of the war. American infantry, emboldened by the destruction of the lead tank, began engaging the retreating Germans with small arms fire. A second bazooka team, positioned further along the ridge, fired at the last tank in the column but missed, the rocket exploding harmlessly against a tree. For Rusconi and Wilson, the engagement validated months of training. They had successfully engaged and destroyed a Panzer IV, a significant achievement for infantry soldiers who had been in combat for less than a month. Their success represented the changing dynamic between tanks and infantry that characterized the later stages of World War II. Wagner, dazed and injured, crawled toward the drainage ditch alongside the road, seeking cover from the increasing American fire. He had entered the engagement with 4 years of combat experience and a crew that had become like family. In less than a minute, that reality had been shattered by a weapon he had been told was ineffective against the improved armor of his Panzer IV. The psychological impact of this encounter extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. For German tank crews, it represented a shocking revelation. American infantry now possessed a weapon that could destroy their armor with a single shot at close range. This knowledge transformed the tankers' perception of the battlefield, forcing them to view every hedgerow, building, and woodline as a potential death trap. For American infantry, the effectiveness of the bazooka provided a crucial morale boost at a critical moment in the Battle of the Bulge. The knowledge that they could fight back effectively against German armor helped maintain cohesion and determination, even when units found themselves surrounded or cut off from support. The engagement at the wooded ridge was one of hundreds that occurred during the chaotic opening days of the German offensive. Yet it exemplified the changing nature of armored warfare as the technological balance shifted. The development and deployment of man-portable anti-tank weapons like the bazooka had fundamentally altered a dynamic that had defined much of the early war years. In the hours following the engagement, American forces in the sector consolidated their positions, reinforced by artillery units that had displaced to avoid the initial German barrage. The destruction of Wagner's tank and the repulse of the supporting armor bought critical time for the defensive line to stabilize. Wagner, suffering from burns and a concussion, was recovered by German infantry advancing behind the tank column. Evacuated to a field hospital, he would spend weeks recovering before returning to duty. His survival was unusual. Statistical analysis after the war would show that fewer than 20% of German tank crewmen survived when their vehicle was penetrated and caught fire. For the German command, the widespread presence of bazookas among American infantry represented an unanticipated complication to their offensive plans. Tank commanders were forced to operate with increased caution, often requiring infantry support to clear suspected anti-tank positions before advancing. This more deliberate approach consumed precious time in an offensive where speed was essential for success. The technical aspects of the engagement highlighted the ongoing evolution of armored warfare. The Panzer IV, originally designed in the 1930s as a support tank, had undergone numerous upgrades to keep it viable on the 1944 battlefield. Its frontal armor had been increased to 80 mm, sufficient to resist most Allied anti-tank guns at medium ranges. However, the side armor remained relatively thin at 30 mm, creating a vulnerability that weapons like the bazooka could exploit. The American M1A1 rocket launcher represented a different philosophy, providing infantry with organic anti-tank capability without requiring heavy, crew-served weapons that limited mobility. The shaped charge warhead, with its ability to defeat armor regardless of its thickness, within the technology's limitations, exemplified the ongoing contest between offensive and defensive technologies. By the evening of December 17th, reports of similar engagements had reached the headquarters of the 12th SS Panzer Division. Multiple Panzers had been disabled or destroyed by bazooka fire, often from concealed positions at close range. Unit commanders began adjusting tactics, emphasizing the need for infantry to advance ahead of tanks in areas where ambushes were possible, a complete reversal of the Blitzkrieg doctrine that had served Germany so effectively earlier in the war. The microcosm of Wagner's encounter with Rusconi's bazooka team reflected larger strategic realities. Germany's ability to replace lost tanks and trained crews had diminished dramatically by late 1944, while American production and training pipelines were operating at peak efficiency. Each Panzer lost represented an irreplaceable asset for Germany, while the United States could deploy newly manufactured weapons and trained personnel in seemingly endless supply. The human dimension of the encounter underscored the personal cost of industrial warfare. Wagner lost longtime comrades in a moment of violence that ended years of shared experience and camaraderie. Rusconi and Wilson, while successful in their mission, witnessed the horrific reality of their weapons' effectiveness. Men burning alive inside a steel coffin of their own making, neither side would emerge psychologically unscathed from such encounters. As night fell on December 17th, the strategic situation remained fluid. German forces had made significant gains in some sectors, while encountering unexpected resistance in others. The weather continued to favor the offensive, with fog and low clouds preventing Allied air forces from intervening. Yet the timetable had already begun to slip, and with each passing hour, American forces improved their defensive positions. The confrontation between Panzer crews and bazooka teams would be repeated hundreds of times in the coming days, with similar patterns emerging. The traditional advantages of tanks, mobility, firepower, and protection were increasingly offset by the proliferation of infantry anti-tank weapons. This dynamic would continue to evolve through the final months of the war, influencing both tactical decisions and equipment design. For military historians, the Battle of the Bulge offers a fascinating case study in the interaction of technology, tactics, and human factors under the extreme pressure of combat. The effectiveness of weapons like the bazooka against German armor demonstrated how apparently minor technical innovations could create significant tactical repercussions, ultimately influencing the outcome of major operations. As dawn broke on December 18th, both sides prepared to continue the struggle. Wagner, recovering in a field hospital, would never see his tank or most of his crew again. Rusconi and Wilson, having proven their effectiveness, would be assigned to additional anti-tank ambush positions as the battle developed. Their brief, violent encounter represented just one moment in the massive conflict engulfing the Ardennes, yet it exemplified the changing face of modern warfare. The bazooka's impact extended beyond its immediate tactical effect. German intelligence had been aware of the weapon's existence since its introduction in North Africa, but had underestimated its effectiveness against their improved armor. This miscalculation contributed to operational planning that did not sufficiently account for American anti-tank capabilities at the infantry level. Similarly, American commanders had not fully appreciated the psychological advantage the bazooka provided to their troops. Infantry units that might otherwise have surrendered when confronted with armor instead fought effectively, knowing they possessed the means to destroy even the most formidable tanks. This confidence influenced countless small unit actions throughout the battle. As Wagner drifted in and out of consciousness in the overcrowded field hospital, His thoughts returned repeatedly to the moment of impact, the flash, the sound, and the realization that his tank, which had survived dozens of engagements on two fronts, had been defeated by a simple tube carried by an American infantryman. The technological balance had shifted, and with it, the fundamental nature of armored warfare. In the days following his injury, Wagner learned the full extent of the disaster that had befallen his unit. Of the 12 Panzers that had begun the advance on December 16th, 5 had been destroyed by bazookas, 3 had been disabled by American artillery, and 2 had been abandoned after mechanical breakdowns. Only 2 remained operational. The human cost was even higher. Of the 60 men who comprised the tank crews, 28 were dead, 17 wounded, and 5 missing. Years later, Wagner would describe December 1944 as the moment when we realized we were no longer hunters, but had become the hunted. For the American forces, the successful employment of bazookas against German armor represented a critical factor in their ability to slow and eventually halt the German offensive. The 99th Infantry Division, initially considered green with minimal combat experience, held critical terrain for days against determined German attacks, buying time for reinforcements to arrive. Their stand, enabled in part by the effectiveness of their anti-tank weapons, would later be recognized as one of the decisive actions of the battle. Private First Class Rusconi continued to serve with distinction throughout the remainder of the Battle of the Bulge. On December 20th, his bazooka team destroyed a 2nd Panzer and disabled a Panther tank at an intersection near Krinkelt. For these actions, he would eventually receive the Silver Star. Wilson, his loader, was wounded by shell fragments on December 21st, but recovered and returned to duty in February 1945. The technical aspects of the bazooka versus tank confrontation reveal much about the evolving nature of armored warfare. The M1A1 bazooka fired a rocket with a shaped charge warhead containing approximately 3.5 pounds of Composition B explosive. This created a focused jet of superheated metal moving at approximately 30,000 feet per second, sufficient to penetrate up to 4 inches, 102 mm, of homogeneous steel armor. This performance meant that the bazooka could defeat the side, rear, and in some cases even the frontal armor of most German tanks. The shaped charge principle represented a fundamental departure from traditional kinetic energy anti-tank projectiles. Rather than relying on mass and velocity to punch through armor, shaped charges used the Monroe effect to focus explosive energy in a specific direction. This allowed relatively lightweight weapons to defeat armor that would have required much larger conventional projectiles. For German tank designers, the proliferation of shaped charge weapons created a significant challenge. Traditional methods of improving protection by simply adding more armor became increasingly impractical, as shaped charges could defeat almost any reasonable thickness of homogeneous steel. Alternative approaches, such as spaced armor, creating air gaps to disrupt the formation of the penetrating jet, or armor skirts, provided only partial solutions. The operational impact of the bazooka was magnified by its widespread distribution among American infantry units. Unlike anti-tank guns, which were concentrated in specialized units, bazookas were organic to rifle companies, with multiple teams in each platoon. This meant that German armor could encounter anti-tank resistance anywhere American infantry was present, not just in sectors where dedicated anti-tank units had been positioned. By December 22, 1944, the initial German momentum had largely dissipated. Fuel shortages, stubborn American resistance, and improving weather, which allowed Allied air forces to attack German columns, had combined to stall the offensive well short of its objectives. The experience of Wagner's unit was replicated across the front, with German armor suffering unsustainable losses to a combination of bazookas, artillery, and increasingly, air attacks. In American tactical evaluations conducted after the battle, the effectiveness of bazooka teams was highlighted as a key factor in the defensive success. Reports emphasized the importance of proper positioning, fire discipline, waiting for flank shots rather than engaging frontal armor, and immediate relocation after firing to avoid German counterfire. For German commanders, the widespread presence of effective infantry anti-tank weapons necessitated a re-evaluation of armored tactics. The practice of sending tanks forward without infantry support, which had been successful in earlier campaigns, proved increasingly costly in the face of proliferating anti-tank weapons. The blitzkrieg concept, based on rapid, deep penetration by armored spearheads, became more difficult to execute when every hedgerow potentially concealed a weapon capable of destroying a tank. By late December, the strategic situation had shifted decisively. General George S. Patton's Third Army had relieved the besieged American forces at Bastogne, and counterattacks were beginning to compress the German salient from multiple directions. The offensive that Hitler had hoped would split the Allied armies and potentially change the course of the war had failed, though fighting would continue into January 1945. Wagner spent 6 weeks recovering from his injuries before being assigned to a replacement depot in February 1945. There, he encountered a military system struggling to cope with catastrophic losses. New tank crews received minimal training before being sent to the front, often with only a basic understanding of their vehicle's operation and no practical experience in combat tactics. The quality of equipment was similarly declining, with late-war Panzers showing the effects of material shortages and rushed production. In contrast, the American military-industrial complex continued to produce weapons, ammunition, and equipment in seemingly limitless quantities. By early 1945, improved versions of the bazooka were reaching frontline units, along with new tanks, artillery, and aircraft. The material disparity between the opposing forces, evident since the Normandy landings, had become overwhelming. Wagner received command of a Panzer IV in March 1945, just in time to participate in the desperate defensive battles along the Rhine River. His new crew consisted almost entirely of teenagers with minimal training, a stark contrast to the veterans he had led earlier in the war. Their first engagement against elements of the American 3rd Armored Division ended with their tank disabled by artillery fire. Though the crew survived, the tank was abandoned during the subsequent retreat. For Rusconi, the war continued through the Allied advance into Germany. His unit participated in the capture of Cologne in March 1945, where he witnessed the devastation caused by Allied bombing and artillery. By the time Germany surrendered in May, his original bazooka had been replaced by the improved M9 version, though the fundamental operating principles remained the same. The technological confrontation between tank and anti-tank weapons that had played out in the snow-covered forests of the Ardennes continued to influence military thinking long after the war ended. The bazooka demonstrated that relatively simple, inexpensive weapons could effectively counter much more complex and costly armored vehicles, a dynamic that would shape weapons development throughout the Cold War and beyond. In the immediate post-war period, both American and Soviet forces developed improved versions of infantry anti-tank rockets based on wartime experience. The Soviet RPG-2, introduced in 1949, drew heavily on captured German Panzer designs, themselves developed after examining captured American bazookas. The American Super Bazooka, M20, standardized in 1950, increased penetration capabilities to deal with improved Soviet armor. For tank designers, the challenge of protecting against shaped charge weapons led to fundamental changes in armor technology. Conventional homogeneous steel armor, no matter how thick, proved inadequate against the focused energy of shaped charges. This led to the development of composite and reactive armor systems that continue to evolve in modern armored vehicles. The human dimension of the tank versus anti-tank dynamic also influenced post-war military doctrine. The psychological impact on tank crews of knowing they could be destroyed by a well-hidden infantryman affected tactics, training, and equipment design. Similarly, the confidence provided to infantry by effective anti-tank weapons influenced small unit tactics and morale considerations. Wagner survived the war, surrendering to American forces near Kassel in April 1945. After 3 years as a prisoner of war, he returned to Germany in 1948 to find a country transformed. He would eventually work as a mechanic in Stuttgart, occasionally corresponding with other survivors from his wartime unit, but rarely speaking about his experiences. When asked about the war by his children, he would often respond simply, "We thought our tanks made us invincible. We were wrong." Rusconi returned to Boston in late 1945, using the GI Bill to attend engineering school. His wartime experience with the bazooka sparked an interest in weapons design, leading to a career with a defense contractor working on guided missile systems. The shaped charge technology that he had employed against German tanks would form the basis for many of the weapons systems he helped develop during the Cold War. The Battle of the Bulge, in which the confrontation between Panzer crews and bazooka teams played such a crucial role, is now recognized as the largest and costliest battle fought by American forces in World War II. Over 600,000 American soldiers participated, with casualties exceeding 80,000. German losses were even higher, with many experienced units effectively destroyed as fighting forces. For military historians, the battle provides a fascinating case study in how technological advantages interact with tactical employment, strategic circumstances, and human factors. The effectiveness of weapons like the bazooka demonstrates how relatively simple innovations can have disproportionate effects on battlefield outcomes, especially when widely distributed and properly employed. The confrontation between armor and anti-armor continues to shape military thinking in the 21st century. Modern anti-tank missiles are direct descendants of the bazooka, though greatly improved in range, accuracy, and lethality. Contemporary tank designers still grapple with the fundamental challenge presented by shaped charge weapons, developing increasingly sophisticated protection systems in response. The psychological dimension of this confrontation remains equally relevant. The knowledge that one's armored vehicle, regardless of its sophistication, can be destroyed by a single hit from a weapon that can be carried by an individual soldier creates a unique stress for tank crews. This reality influences everything from tactical doctrine to crew training to vehicle design features focused on survivability. In the decades following World War II, both Wagner and Rusconi had opportunities to reflect on their brief, violent encounter in the Ardennes. Wagner, in a rare interview given in 1978, observed, "The bazooka changed everything for us. Before, we would advance confidently, knowing that infantry had little chance against our armor. After, we moved with constant fear, seeing every bush, every window, every pile of rubble as a potential threat. It was not just a weapon, it was a psychological weapon." Rusconi, speaking at a veterans reunion in 1985, offered a complementary perspective. "The bazooka gave us a chance. Without it, what could an infantryman do against a tank? Run, hide. With the bazooka, we could fight back. That made all the difference, not just in what we could do, but in how we felt about being out there in the snow, with German armor all around us." The technological balance between offensive and defensive capabilities, exemplified by the tank versus anti-tank dynamic, represents one of the fundamental constants in military history. New weapons prompt new countermeasures, which in turn drive the development of improved weapons, a cycle that continues to the present day. The confrontation between German Panzer crews and American bazooka teams in the winter of 1944-45 represents just one chapter in this ongoing evolution. For Wagner and his fellow tank commanders, the psychological impact of vulnerable armor created a cascading effect on tactical decision-making. Advances became more cautious, routes were chosen for concealment rather than speed, and infantry support was increasingly required before tanks would advance into areas where ambushes were possible. This more deliberate approach consumed critical time and initiative during an offensive where rapid progress was essential for success. American after-action reports highlighted the effectiveness of properly employed bazookas while also noting limitations. The weapon's relatively short range required teams to allow German tanks to approach to within 100 yards or less, a nerve-wracking experience even for veteran infantry. The distinctive launch signature, smoke and flash, immediately revealed the firing position, necessitating rapid movement after engaging. Despite these challenges, the psychological advantage provided to infantry by having an effective anti-tank capability proved invaluable during the desperate defensive battles of the Bulge. By January 1945, as the Battle of the Bulge concluded with the elimination of the German salient, the strategic situation in the European theater had been irrevocably altered. The German offensive consumed irreplaceable resources in men, machines, and fuel, leaving their forces significantly weakened for the defense of the Reich. The psychological impact of the failed offensive further undermined German morale, with many soldiers recognizing that defeat was now inevitable. For American forces, surviving and eventually defeating the German offensive provided a significant confidence boost. Units that had been considered green prior to December 1944 emerged from the battle as veteran formations, having proven themselves under the most challenging conditions. The effectiveness of weapons like the bazooka contributed to this confidence, demonstrating that American equipment and training were equal or superior to their German counterparts. The technical evolution of both tanks and anti-tank weapons continued through the final months of the war. German designers introduced the Panzer Faust 250 with improved range and penetration compared to earlier versions, while American forces received the M9 bazooka with better sights and more reliable ignition systems. These incremental improvements reflected the ongoing effort to gain advantage in the tank versus anti-tank competition. For the men who fought in these engagements, the experience left enduring impressions that would shape their perspectives long after the war ended. Tank crewmen like Wagner developed a heightened awareness of vulnerability, understanding that their armored vehicles provided limited protection against increasingly effective anti-tank weapons. Infantry soldiers like Rusconi gained confidence from possessing the means to defeat armored threats, though this came with the sobering knowledge of the human cost when their weapons found their mark. The legacy of this technological and tactical confrontation extended well beyond the immediate context of World War II. The principle that infantry must possess organic anti-tank capability became firmly established in military doctrine worldwide. The development of more effective shaped charge weapons continued, leading eventually to guided anti-tank missiles that could engage armor at ranges far beyond those possible with rocket launchers like the bazooka. Tank design philosophy also evolved in response to the shaped charge threat. The conventional approach of adding more steel armor proved increasingly impractical, as shaped charges demonstrated the ability to defeat almost any reasonable thickness. Alternative protection concepts, including spaced armor, composite materials, and eventually reactive armor systems, emerged as designers sought to counter the shaped charge advantage. By the time of the Korean War, 1950-1953, both the United States and Soviet Union had fielded improved infantry anti-tank weapons based directly on lessons learned during World War II. The American 3.5-inch Super Bazooka offered significantly improved penetration capability compared to its wartime predecessor, while the Soviet RPG-2 incorporated features from both captured German and American designs. The confrontation between armored vehicles and infantry anti-tank weapons has continued to evolve through subsequent conflicts, from Vietnam to the Middle East to Ukraine. Each iteration of this technological competition has influenced both weapon design and tactical employment, yet the fundamental dynamic established during engagements like Wagner's encounter with Rusconi's bazooka team remains relevant. The vulnerability of even sophisticated armored vehicles to relatively simple anti-tank weapons in the hands of determined infantry. For military planners, this reality has profound implications for force structure, training priorities, and equipment acquisition. The psychological impact on both tank crews, knowing their vulnerability, and infantry, possessing effective counters to armor, influences morale, tactical decision-making, and unit effectiveness in ways that extend far beyond the immediate technical parameters of the weapons involved. The winter of 1944-45 marked a significant inflection point in this ongoing competition between armor and anti-armor systems. The widespread deployment of effective infantry anti-tank weapons fundamentally altered a dynamic that had favored armored forces since the introduction of tanks in World War I. While tanks remained essential for mobile warfare, their invulnerability to infantry weapons, a cornerstone of early armored doctrine, had been permanently compromised. In the specific context of the Battle of the Bulge, the effectiveness of weapons like the bazooka contributed significantly to the American defensive success. Infantry units that might otherwise have been overwhelmed by German armor instead held critical terrain, slowing the offensive and buying time for reinforcements to arrive. The psychological boost provided by possessing effective anti-tank capabilities helped maintain morale during the challenging early days of the German attack. For the German forces, the unexpected effectiveness of American anti-tank weapons represented just one of many factors that contributed to the failure of the Ardennes offensive. Fuel shortages, deteriorating weather, stiffening American resistance, and the fundamental strategic reality of facing an opponent with vastly superior resources all combined to doom Hitler's last gamble in the West. Yet the tactical impact of weapons like the bazooka played a crucial role in specific engagements that collectively shaped the battle's outcome. By April 1945, as Allied forces advanced deep into Germany, the technological and tactical lessons of the Ardennes campaign had been thoroughly absorbed by both sides. American infantry routinely integrated bazooka teams into their tactical planning, while German armored units operated with a constant awareness of their vulnerability to infantry anti-tank weapons. The psychological dimension of this dynamic, perhaps as significant as the physical effects of the weapons themselves, influenced countless tactical decisions in the war's final months. The post-war analysis of the Battle of the Bulge by military historians and professional military education institutions has highlighted the confrontation between German armor and American anti-tank capabilities as a key factor in the battle's outcome. The engagement between Wagner's Panzer IV and Rusconi's bazooka team serves as an illustrative example of this larger pattern, a microcosm of the technological and tactical trends that shaped the wider conflict. For Wagner, the war ended with surrender to American forces near Kassel in April 1945. After processing through several prisoner-of-war camps, he was eventually released in 1948 and returned to a Germany transformed by defeat and occupation. Like many veterans, he rarely spoke of his wartime experiences, focusing instead on rebuilding his life in the emerging Federal Republic. When asked about the war by his children years later, he would often respond with a simple observation: "We thought technology would bring us victory. In the end, it was just one more way to die." Rusconi returned to Massachusetts in November 1945, taking advantage of the GI Bill to study mechanical engineering at Boston University. His wartime experience with anti-tank weapons sparked an interest in munitions design that would shape his subsequent career with defense contractors. By the 1960s, he was working on guidance systems for anti-tank missiles, direct descendants of the bazooka he had employed so effectively in the Ardennes. The technological lineage connecting the M1A1 bazooka to modern anti-tank systems is clear and direct. The fundamental principle of the shaped-charge warhead remains a cornerstone of anti-armor technology, though significantly refined and improved in subsequent decades. Similarly, the concept of providing infantry with organic anti-tank capability has become a standard feature of military organization worldwide. For tank designers, the challenge presented by shaped-charge weapons has driven continuous innovation in protection systems. From the relatively simple expedient of attaching spare track links to vulnerable areas, as Wagner's crew had done, to the sophisticated composite and reactive armor systems of modern main battle tanks, the effort to counter-shaped charge effectiveness remains a central focus of armored vehicle development. The human dimension of this technological competition is equally enduring. Tank crews continue to operate with the knowledge that their vehicles, despite increasingly sophisticated protection systems, remain vulnerable to weapons that can be carried and operated by individual soldiers. This awareness shapes everything from tactical doctrine to training emphasis to crew psychology. Similarly, infantry forces derive significant confidence from possessing weapons capable of defeating even the most formidable armored threats. This psychological advantage translates into tactical aggressiveness and morale resilience that extends well beyond the immediate technical capabilities of the anti-tank systems themselves. The confrontation between German Panzer crews and American Bazooka teams in the winter of 1944-45 thus represents more than just a historical footnote in the largest land battle fought by American forces in World War II. It exemplifies an enduring dynamic in modern warfare, the ongoing competition between protective systems and the weapons designed to defeat them, played out against the backdrop of human courage, fear, training, and determination. As the veterans of that bitter winter fighting in the Ardennes forests have gradually passed from the scene, the technological and tactical lessons of their experience remain relevant to contemporary military operations. The fundamental dynamic established in those snow-covered woods, the vulnerability of armored vehicles to determined infantry with appropriate weapons, continues to shape battlefield outcomes from the Middle East to Eastern Europe. In the final analysis, the confrontation between Wagner's Panzer IV and Rusconi's Bazooka team represents a pivotal moment in the evolution of modern warfare, a point at which the dominance of armored vehicles was successfully challenged by a relatively simple infantry weapon. The ripple effects of this technological and tactical shift continue to influence military thinking nearly 8 decades later, a testament to the enduring significance of those desperate winter battles in the forests of Belgium and Luxembourg.